tonight, we have Justin Randolph Thompson, who is with us. Justin has been living in Florence for a number of years and has created and runs the Black History Month Florence program, is a practicing artist of his own performance art practice, and is also a lecturer in many of the international programs here. So I will now hand over to Justin for his lecture on the recovery plan. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be present here with the British Institute, with which Black History Month Florence has been partnered since 2017. So it's really great to reconnect with all of you and to connect with your audience in this virtual phase where perhaps the audience is also an extended one. Thank you all for joining us. And my name is Justin Randolph Thompson, and I'm originally from Westchester County, New York. I lived in many different parts of the United States before moving to Italy, but I've been in Florence since 1999. As Simon said, I'm a working artist, but my work also connects to sort of the social engagement that I like to sort of take on. And I think that some of the connecting threads between my own approach to sort of making art and my own approach to thinking about scholarship, to thinking about research, and to thinking about history will all emerge through this conversation tonight. The conversation revolves around some of the work that we do within Black History Month Florence, which has been carried forth over the past 5 years. And so I'll try to share with you the first slide. This image, really, I put it in here because I think that one of the things that we've been trying to really do is that Black History Month Florence was established in 2016 as a platform network to sort of collect a whole bunch of different voices that were thinking about Afro-descendant cultures and people in the context of Italy, and to sort of really think about the ways in which we might be able to sort of inject some of the history of Florence with these histories that have simply been left out of the narration. A lot of our work is really about sort of giving a sense to the fact that the relationship between Africa and the territory now known as Italy has existed for as long as recorded history has been brought down to us. And so what you see here on this opening slide is just the series of projects that have been born. Because in 2016, together with another American DJ and musician and thinker named Andre Halyard, we decided we would start this platform sort of very much in the spirit of do it yourself. And we initiated it really just by trying to think about who's doing this work in the country, who's doing this work in the city, who can be involved in the conversation. And that's been something that we've sort of really stuck to. The first edition had 20 events, and we've since done over 200 events in the past 5 years. We work with over 40 different partners in the process. And in the process, we've also developed a whole series of research projects. Basically, we started with the idea of creating a series of events every February that would celebrate many different facets of Afro-descendant cultures here that were in partnership with a range of different spaces supported by the Comune Firenze. And basically, it's broken down into Black History Month Florence, which we say BHMF films, BHMF art, BHMF tours, BHMF workshops, BHMF kids, BHMF lectures, and then BHMF food. And all of these different facets are explored through our sort of partnerships. But what we found is that very quickly, the month of February became a huge limitation to the kinds of work that we were really interested in doing and the kinds of work that we were supporting. And so we established a range of research projects to help us to sort of grow that. One of those projects is a sort of training program for other Black History Month initiatives to start up with the idea that perhaps we can facilitate the expansion of this kind of work to other cities of Florence where it's very needed. The first of those is Black History Month Bologna, which was started in 2020. And we're working right now on trying to sort of activate a number of other cities through this process. Then we established this whole range of things that you see the logos representing. So one image representing the project, which I'll talk about in most depth tonight, which is on Being Present, which is a project we've developed with the Uffizi Galleries. But then there's also Black Archive Alliance, which is a project that looks into the archives and the archival documentation that happens in the context of Florence in relation to Africa, and the YGBI research residency, which brings together and collectivizes young Afro-descendant artists based in Italy. Fischi per Fiaschi, which is sort of a workshop platform to think about the role of positionality and specificity in the ways in which we think about culture. And then the recovery plan, which is the overarching theme that I'll be talking about tonight. So we'll sort of dive straight in. And I wanted to start with this quote, which is from Nana Aduse Poku, who I wanted to sort of cite her work because when I was writing about On Being Present, when I was curating it, I was reflecting upon an essay that she wrote about museums that was called On Being Present When You Wish to Disappear. And this quote is at the start of the project On Being Present's web presence on the Uffizi site. So there is no healing presence when the wounded past is erased from our cultural memory and archive. The void this erasure produces fills empty gestures with violence rather than possibilities of relation. And you know, I really thought at length about what this meant and what it could stand for in the context of Italy, the ways in which the city of Florence is narrated typically, and the kinds of exclusions that happen in that historical narration, and the ways in which we're trying to influence that. So basically, I want to start by looking at something that really places me and you know, positions me as an artist. Again, as I said before, I'm from the United States of America. I was really born and raised in that context, and Blackness is something that just simply it was all around me. It's part of the culture in which I was brought up in, so in that context, there's a lot of ways in which key figures that are able to connect the dots between art and research have really been influential to me. This is a series of charts that were created by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900 for the Paris Expo. And this was created in order to sort of begin to narrate the realities connected to African Americans in that moment in time, and to talk about it through statistics, but then also through photographs. And this is talking about the values, the value of taxable property, the value of household and kitchen furniture, and then the overall value of town and city property, right? So this is a series of charts, and what I'm really interested in is the way in which he was not only interested in the collection of this data, but he was also interested in rendering it visible. So the visuality of these charts, and I can tell you I have a whole book on them. There's many that were made. They're very new conceptions of what a chart would look like. And they are very in sync with thinking about aesthetics and really thinking about the impact of aesthetics in relation to data. So it was about this idea that the data is maybe not enough, but we need this other layer of mediation, right? And he coupled these with a series of photographs that he was taking in the time to sort of narrate that history. On the left, you can actually see the exhibition as it was set up in the Paris Expo. And so you have a number of these charts, stands, documents, books, and then you can see W. Bois himself sitting within the stand that won actually the best stand in that expo. The images on the right are from a book that was recently published that has all of the charts and all of the photographs that accompanied them, with some reflections on the significance of what it meant to narrate this kind of history. Black History Month Florence is born in a context of Florence, Italy, but it comes out of this whole legacy that we're borrowing. And that is the legacy of Black History Month, which was born in 1926 in the United States of America through an educator named Carter G. Woodson. And Carter G. Woodson basically was thinking about the fact that in the institutions that we had across the United States, in the school system, there was not enough narration of Black history, of the history of African Americans. And this sort of leaving out of these narratives made it complicated for everybody. It made it complicated for African Americans to not be represented in the historical narration, but then it made it complicated for the whole of society that was reading this to not see the broader picture of what US history means, right? And how it was constructed. And so I really draw upon these things for a number of different reasons. And I'll go ahead and give you the last biographical note through my grandfather. And I think it's always practice whenever I'm giving a lecture to sort of call one of my ancestors into the room. And this is my grandfather, whose name is Randolph Bromry. And Randolph Bromry was the first Black chancellor of the University of Massachusetts in the 70s. And he's also responsible for having gone and physically claimed all the documents of W.B. Du Bois in Cairo from his wife, Shirley Du Bois, and brought them to the University of Massachusetts to establish the W.B. Du Bois Library. My grandfather was also involved in creating an endowment that would ensure that they would be digitized, right? And so all of these different facets of thinking about history, my grandfather really brought them to me. The other layer that he brought to me was music. He was a jazz musician. His father was a jazz musician. So besides being a geophysicist, he was also a musician. And he always saw the sort of layering of art, science, and history. And this is something that he really brought forth to us. There's many other people in my family history that I could speak to in this way, but he's one that I look to very often as I'm thinking about sort of the work that I'm doing here. Not least because my grandfather was also a Black Italian. And so my grandfather was, my great grandmother was an Italian orphan originally from Parma, who grew up in a Black community in the United States in the South. And she married a jazz musician who was this really incredible man that was my great grandfather. And so my grandfather, when I got married, was extremely happy about this idea of me sort of reconnecting somehow this family lineage that he felt was rarely represented. And I never really thought about the significance of him and his relation to Italy until very recently, I have to say. So despite having been here for so long, I always knew about this, but I never really thought about the significance of that. And now with the work that I do, where I'm connected with a lot of young Black Italians that speak through the language of like second generation Italians and these kinds of terms, I'm brought often to think about him and what it means for my mother to then have this legacy as a second generation, and then what that means of me, right, coming back to live here in Italy. And I think that there's some really interesting layers that are brought up through that process. To introduce a little bit my own work as an artist, this is just one image. I'll share with you two images that relate to my own artwork. This is from a project that I did in 2014 that is called Fit the Battle. And basically, the project was done to celebrate the life and legacy of Paul Robeson. Sorry, I'm having a slight trouble. There we go. Paul Robeson, who was a musician, activist, athlete, lawyer, a whole bunch of different things. And Robeson, one of the things that I was really inspired by was the ways in which Robeson used his art for activism. And so he was famous for going and singing on the front lines, for example, of the Spanish Civil War, or singing for the workers in a labor struggle, right, in the 40s in Wales. So really thinking about all these geographies being connected, and the labor struggle is something that was connected, and really using his voice as a singer to engage in these things. And I was born in Peekskill, New York, as I said, and in Peekskill in 1949, there was something that's been called, it's been termed now the Peekskill riots. But in reality, what the Peekskill riots were was a concert that was designed to happen in 1949 with Paul Robeson. And basically, when it was announced that he was going to be singing there, which he had done before, because of recent statements that he had made in France, in which he said that he didn't think that African Americans should be fighting for the U.S. military, given that the U.S. would not defend their rights at home. And when he announced that he would be singing in Peekskill, New York, and when he announced that the funding that would have been taken from this concert, it was a benefit concert, would go to sort of help a number of African Americans who were at the time under McCarthyism being accused of being communists. This really sort of raised a lot of hairs in Peekskill, and a number of white military veterans actually came out, lined the streets with stones, and prepared to stone and beat the concert goers, and if they could, Paul Robeson himself. Now, he didn't arrive in time to get stoned, let's say, in this first occasion. But then after this, he decided that he would do the concert anyway. He brought together 1,000 union workers to create a chain around him, a human chain that would protect the concert goers. He played from the back of a pickup truck parked underneath a tree to avoid snipers, and he performed this concert. And that sort of after that concert, when it ended, the police cleared out, and indeed the concert goers were stoned. Cars were broken, people were beaten. And I don't know if you could call it a riot, because I think that a lot of times the words that we use around riot are a little bit more directed in other directions, let's say. But this is something that remains the legacy in Peekskill, New York of Paul Robeson. And because I'm someone who's interested in history and interested in monuments and interested in excavating narratives, I wanted to go to Peekskill, New York, where I was born, and give a different picture of Paul Robeson, give a different reflection. And to do so, I recruited a whole group. All the people you see sitting here are a bunch of different artists that I was working with at Salem Artworks, which is in Salem, New York, who came down with me. They helped me to produce the objects, and they were a part of the performance itself. The two people that you see sitting center, who are not wearing the hats and everything else, are from the church in Peekskill, New York, who are part of the choir, and they came to work with me. I invited a baritone sax army to sort of come out and think about the baritone voice of Paul Robeson. And then the speaker that you see up there is Mark Anthony Neal, who I invited to sort of speak about the legacy of Paul Robeson directly as part of the performance. And so a lot of my work really brings together the sort of history, the scholarship, the performance, art, all these layers into something that can then be repeated. And this is a website that was designed, Fit the Battle, to host this project. And I'll share with you one other project that shares a similar strategy. And it's a project that's called Friskin' the Whiskers. And this is a project that is designed to celebrate the jazz history of New York City by reactivating the reflection on the economics of jazz. And one of the things that we did is we brought together an open call that invited jazz musicians to come and compete for rent money. And the idea was to draw upon a tradition that was invented in the 20s in New York City of the rent party, where jazz musicians would simply call their friends around and people would pay a nominal fee to get in the door. And at the end of this party where they would play music, they could pay the rent. And so I like this sort of DIY approach to sort of getting by, right, to paying the bills. And I think the economics of jazz and the economics of art are in a really bad place and have been a really bad place for a very long time. And so I wanted to call attention to that. And so what we did is we performed on the front stoops of the homes of a bunch of historical jazz musicians. To list a few, we're standing there in front of Charlie Parker's home in the East Village. We performed in front of Duke Ellington's home in Harlem, and in front of Sonny Rollins' home, Lower East Side, Cannonball Adderley in Queens, and in Brooklyn in front of UB Blake's home. And the idea was that these musicians would be playing in sort of battles, and then we would have jazz legends, these musicians that had been around for a long time in New York, that were judging the bout and deciding who would get the rent money. And so what you're seeing there is Bill Saxton, who's a historic musician based in Harlem, who's judging the bout. And we had invited a number of musicologists to come in and chime in on the histories that were represented by those. And everything was done on site to really think about the ways in which these spaces still have the energy. And I think that this connects to a lot of the ways in which I think about Florence as well, and the kind of energy and resonance that every space has here. This is a list of the musicologists that were invited to speak. And again, I made a website for this because it's something that I've been working on repeating. So we've done 2 editions and I'm working on the 3rd right now. But that gives you a sense of how I've organized through my artwork. And instead, I think, getting to Italy, before coming to Italy, the perception that I had of what Italy represented was very much through images like this. And the celebration of ancient Rome, mainly through film, through cinema in my childhood, was something that I think really sparked an interest. And I think that one of the things that I was really attracted to was the sort of the scale and ambition that a lot of these works represented. But I think one of the things that I left out, because it was left out of the narrations that were given to me in my art history class, was the social realities that these things represent. And so somehow it was sort of left out of the narration, the fact that really what we're looking at is a symbol of colonial expansion and of dominance. And this is something that, is represented through arches that are erected on territories that were taken over by ancient Rome. But then it's also something that's represented in a different way and perhaps more symbolic at home, where we have this ritual of marching through it. And one of the things that struck me later in life was the ways in which these are narrated in very clear and direct ways through these monuments, but they're a reflection perhaps we don't spend enough time thinking about, and the impact of celebrating images like this in all that they represent, and the ways in which these images have then been carried forth and replicated in various contexts, right, as symbols of triumph. I'm very interested in ideas of triumph in regards to spirituality. But this is the kind of stuff I grew up with. My dad was a big fan of these kinds of movies that really romanticized the fall of the ancient Roman Empire. And, the idea that something went wrong, somebody, got careless or overzealous, and hence the entire construction fell apart. But I was always struck by the fact that these narrations never really made it seem like the kind of conquest that was actually being engaged in was wrong in the first place. It was never really shown as forms of invasion. So I was very curious about the ways in which these narrations are being constructed. And I think that in thinking about Florence before I came here, this is the image I had of it. I had taken a Florentine Renaissance history course, and this is the image I expected. And quite strangely, for all of you that are familiar with Florence, this is actually, as photoshopped as this image is, the light really does that sometimes, right? So there are these sort of layers of reality to this romance. But I think that the ways in which Florence constructs a narration of its history as a Renaissance city, a lot of times, first off, evacuates all of those other histories that are present in the city and its contemporaneity. So the fact that it is a contemporary city with all of the contemporary reflections that we can have, and the fact that it's a city that lived through many different historic moments before and beyond the Renaissance, I think is also really important. So when I arrived here, I was expecting to be saturated by all of these layers of Renaissance history and all this kind of thing. Sorry for the bad image of this, but you get the picture. And this is typically, what I actually ran into. But then instead, because I'm somebody who's always also seeking to understand Blackness in the various spaces in which I navigate, this was the kind of representation that I came across in regards to Blackness. And it unsettled a lot of the ways in which I thought about the country of Italy and the ways in which I thought about the city of Florence. And also what I noticed was that it was the dominant narrative. So the dominant narrative that's brought forth by mass media around Blackness in the context of Italy is contemporary migration. There's little space and little room to think about all of the other moments of migrations that have happened over the years, all of the other presences that have been a part of Italian history, the Italian colonialism, like all this stuff is evacuated when we look at it through this lens alone. And, the fact that, there's a political side that works hard to sort of really instill or stir up our values is also something that was not lost to me. And so these are old posters from Lega Nord, even though I don't think that they would be all that different now, that spoke about an othering of people, about a racialization of people, about stereotypes in ways that I think are designed to produce certain anxieties. And those anxieties connect us and keep us distracted and fixed on the contemporary moment of migration as the only thing we should be paying attention to without thinking of the longer history, right? The image on the right was particularly disturbing, that Lega would use an image of Native Americans to sort of represent, the overtaking of the country, right? But anyway, I'm also influenced and informed by things like movements for the change in citizenship laws, right? And this is represented by a group, Italiani Senza Cittadinanza, for example. And this is a photograph from one of the many protests that they have put together. You see in this image, Ijaba Shego, Camille Hawthorne, and Joanne Africo, all sort of thinking about citizenship and what it means to be born in a country, but have to fight for the right to have citizenship. And then also, I think, the elements of more contemporary history that have sort of undoubtedly changed the way in which we have to narrate Florentine history is also through the murder that's been inflicted on Black bodies in this space where Florence is this city where murder is actually incredibly rare. And so when we see in the not very many years, multiple murders of Senegalese men in this case, but in general, I think it should be a cause for reflection. And the fact that we work a lot with Afro-descendant artists, Afro-descendant writers, Afro-descendant thinkers, when they look at and try to understand the history of Florence, this is part of their narration of the city now, right? And there's a couple of images from the more recent murder of Idi Dieng, which happened very close to the British Institute as well. So we can think about that proximity and the ways in which that space is sort of forever changed, right? To get into on being present, I think it's important to sort of start by looking at something like this. This is an image of the Libyan Sibyl. And it's in the Duomo of Siena. And it's actually the first time that when I visited Siena, I went into that Duomo and all of a sudden, this is the image that I encountered. And it became something that was really important for me to begin to recognize. And that was that Black presence is actually written into artwork all over the place. This Sibyl is right in front of the door. And so in a certain sense, you have to walk over her almost as a welcome mat in a way to get into the space and start to navigate it. And she's not the only Black African figure represented in that floor. At the time, I was a graduate student working in sketchbooks mainly to document Black African presence in the museums, in the streets, in the monuments, and all the spaces that surrounded me. And this is just a couple examples of some of the sketches that I was making. And I was really intrigued by the fact that I could not find historical narration at that time in 2000 that brought me information about the figures that I was encountering. And so that sort of void became something that was always on my mind from the very beginning of my arrival in Italy. Then fast forward many, many years. And in around 2013, I first met Awam Ankpa, who's a curator, who developed a project called Resignifications for Florence. And it was designed to be sort of a response and reflection on a number of works that are part of the collection of NYU Florence's Villa La Pietra and the Black African presence within that collection. And basically, within this conference, Black portraitures, and within the space of resignifications, I was able to sort of really see that a different kind of narration, a different kind of conversation could happen in Florence itself. So whereas before I was maybe leaving the country to find all of these things, I could all of a sudden sort of think about what it meant to shape that conversation here. And I was really fortunate to be a part both of Black Portraitures, the conference, and of Resignifications, the exhibition with my work. So it brought both my scholarship and my work into the fore. This is one photograph of some of the participants and contributors to Resignifications and Black Portraitures. This was an opening reception. And I can't tell you how enthralled I was to have all of these people, who a lot of them were my peers, here in Florence with me. But what I saw was that at the end of the exhibition, most of the people that were there left the country. They weren't from here. And then I also noticed that in the rooms where we were seeing these conferences, there was very little participation on behalf of the local population. And that was something else that sort of disturbed me in thinking about the beauty of all this narration that then is not necessarily reaching the people that are living this environment, right, consistently. And so sort of out of that, actually, Black History Month Florence is born. This is the copy of the cover for Resignifications, the catalog that was produced, that has a series of scholars and artists responding to the figure that in the collection is often known as the Moor or the Blackamoor, depending upon different sources. And it really sort of thinks about Black African presence in the sort of collection of Villa La Pietra, but it also extended beyond those doors, right? In 2018, we started a project called Black Archive Alliance, as I mentioned before, and it was started together with Villa Romana as a way of sort of thinking about different spaces in Florence and ways in which we might be able to access the archives, public and private collections, and to think about what they actually have to say to us about the history of Africa and the connection to Italy. And we found a really incredible wealth of information that simply had not been researched, simply had not been shared. We shared a lot of the research that had been done. We connected with a number of different scholars, and we engaged in a project that then turned into sort of mentorships with a range of different students from different institutions working on the research. One of the things that we wanted to do with that was also to unsettle the notion of the archive as being only accessible by a really limited number of people, usually scholars, and what it would mean to invite the public into these spaces that hold our history. And so this is one example of one of the exhibitions that we did directly inside the Istituto Agronomico Oltremare, which was designed to sort of assess the holdings of in Africa and other Italian colonies. And we set up a series of writings, reflections, images that came directly from their archives as a way of highlighting what they had. We also worked with the Alinari archive of photographs and sort of created a focus in there. We did a tour to sort of focus on a series of images. We connected with the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence and looked at some of the kinds of narrations that they hold in their photo archive. And then, you know, for the second volume, we actually created a setup where we had mentors and students that were working in tandem with each other around a series of spaces to sort of continue the work which we basically only were able to map in that first edition. But in the process, we created a catalog, a small catalog that contains a number of our reflections. This particular entry is by Ingrid Greenfield, who's somebody who contributed to the project on Being Present. It was one that we set up in order to sort of begin to think about the archive that is held by a painting collection. In this case, we were looking specifically at the Gioviana collection within the Uffizi galleries, and she focused on this particular image here, which she also wrote about for on Being Present. But I think it's important to mention this because I think that, you know, 2 years before we started on Being Present, this is already work that we were beginning to do. We were already beginning to chart this, and contributors like Ingrid Greenfield were already a part of our network. The same is true about Kate Lowe, who spoke as part of a Black History Month event in collaboration with NYU at the Ospedale dei Innocenti in 2018. So just moving forward, you know, I think it's important to give sort of like shout outs and give a sense of all of the different work that has been done around this subject across the world. So in the same way that Black History Month Florence is not something that we designed from the ground up, it's sort of transplanting and rethinking the strategies around it in this specific environment of Florence. The same is true about Black Archive Alliance, where we're looking at different projects like the Black Archives based in Amsterdam, like the Autograph based in London, in different spaces that are thinking about Blackness in their own cities. But we're also, for something like On Being Present, influenced and inspired by projects like Revealing the African Presence in Renaissance Europe, which was an exhibition that was done with an accompanying catalog available online through the Walters in Baltimore. And a lot of the contributors to this catalog are people that we've been in touch with and reached out to. So in 2013, this exhibition was one that was very important for me to start to sort of think through some of this language. And, you know, more recently in 2019, you had the exhibition that started in the United States in Detroit and eventually made its way to Musée d'Orsay. It's called The Black Model. And the kind of activist work that was happening with this, where in a certain sense, some paintings all of a sudden were being renamed based on the fact that we actually knew who the sitters. So instead of being Portrait of a Woman, it would actually be the name of the sitter. And this became a really interesting reflection. And a lot of people, of course, shared it with me. And at the time, I was thinking about the context of Florence and the ways in which one of the areas that we could not avoid engaging in was Renaissance history. And we had already done some work with the Uffizi galleries through a collaboration with Chiara Totti, who's one of the curators, who had created a project for Tesfaye Ogessa under the directorship of Eike Schmidt. And this is an exhibition that we were able to sort of create a finissage in collaboration with the Uffizi for in 2019. We were able to create a workshop for that painter to come. And so I reached out to the director of the Uffizi and I asked him if he would be interested in us curating a series of reflections, really an ongoing research project that would be multi-year to think about all of the Black African presences that are in the collection and the ways in which those are histories that need to be excavated, discussed, and the ways in which that might be able to also reshape and reframe scholarship itself. This book that you see here, The Image of the Black in Western Art, is this incredible volume that has, I think, I feel like it has like over 10 volumes, still ongoing. And it's an incredible narration through history. But you know, On Being Present really wanted to be extremely accessible, meaning that through using the virtual platform of Hypervisions, which is a platform that was already set up by the Uffizi for virtual exhibitions, using short form text and using a language that is not too overly scholarly, that is accessible to a broader audience. We felt that we would be able to reach a broader audience that is actually really interested in thinking about the narration that's happening in these collections through these paintings and what these histories actually are. And what we found is that actually a lot of the work that needed to be done was really speculative work. A lot of times we actually don't have a lot of written document about the figures in these paintings. What we have is very little information in that context, and then we have the painting itself to speak to us. And so we have to sort of think about what it means to fill in those gaps. And I think that a lot of times scholarship and scholars may not dive into some subjects that are underdocumented because it requires a level of speculation that doesn't tend to sit well with historians. But I think that this sort of speculative research is actually extremely important in unsettling also who should be writing about things, what kind of narration we need, and what it means to sort of start a reflection that has legs, right? That needs to have other scholars pick it up in order to really arrive, which is true about any scholarship. And so we went through a series of images. This one here is of two paintings that we work for by Domenico Tempesti and I'm forgetting the name now. Franco Gonchi, I think his name is, Granchi. Sorry, I apologize if I messed that up at all. But the entry was brought to us by a historian named Temi Odumosu. And she was writing about this figure whose name is Benedetto Silva. And this is a figure that came, in the left, we have this one representation that is very much about the othering of this figure, very much about rendering this figure a sort of curiosity. So the nude chest, the bands on his arms, the boat in the distance, the exotic shell that sits beside him. And then as if that wasn't enough, the arrow that he's holding, as you saw in the previous image, actually identifies him. It tells us where he's from, tells us what his name was. And it also tells us that he was born from two Black parents, because of course the thing that was most exoticized about him was the fact that he was albino. I think in the image you see on the right, instead we have a later image, a later depiction of him by Domenico Tempesti. And basically it's an image that I think fits more snugly into the kind of portraiture that we would expect from this time period. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which just representation can change, right? And what it would mean to sort of create the image on the left, who that's for, right? Who the intended audience is and why it shows up the way it is. Where was it designed to be hung? And the image on the right, who was that for? Who commissioned it? Why it was there to be hung? And Temi Odumosu brings us one of the most poetic entries of the whole group of writings that we initiated. We also went to some images that I think people are a little bit more familiar with, like this one, which is by Justus Sustermans, who was a court painter, painting, I guess, sort of like a fairly atypical subject, right? But I think it's interesting the ways in which an image like this, we're brought to sort of think about the different roles that painting can play, as I was saying before. And so when we think about portraiture, a lot of times we think about that through the lens of sort of representation. And instead, this is portraiture that's designed for sort of like comic relief, right? So this is designed as an inside joke. So by painting the two elderly women that bring geese and eggs to the court, along with a court servant, we sort of have this other perception of what's being narrated here. The entry on this was brought to us by Bruce Edelstein. And you'll see if you look at the list of biographies in regards to the entries that were written, that we've actually worked with a pretty broad range of scholars in different fields and in different sites. In order to sort of really also open up the kind of narration that's brought forth. And so Bruce talks to us also about sort of agricultural labor around the Medici court, which is something that is underexplored, and about the fact that this painting, there's all these symbols that are put in place so that the viewer recognizes that this is intended for comedy and not intended as a celebratory image, right? And so the hand gesture that is being made over the shoulder of the women is one that is designed to sort of provide comic relief. So when we think about Blackness in the context of the Renaissance, I think one of the spaces that we're not unaccustomed to thinking about that is through the lens of servitude, right, in court servants. And I think that, one of the things that was really important was to think about also all of these different kinds of Blackness that existed in the Renaissance period, and all the different ways in which they were portrayed. These are two images that come from the Joviana collection that I mentioned before. The one on the left, which was brought to us by the scholar Ingrid Greenfield, once again, writing on this figure that is more commonly identified as Prester John. And the one on the right, which is a figure of fairly unidentified, but that comes with the name Alcatroff. And what's really intriguing about these two images is that they're images of African rulers. And so this is part of the Joviana collection, which is a collection that celebrates mainly famous and important men. There are some women in the collection, but it's predominantly men, and it's really thinking about the role of power, the role of wealth, and all of these symbols of wealth and power that were really celebrated in that moment. And what we have is Cosimo de' Medici commissioning Cristoforo dell'Altissima to make a series of copies from this painting collection that Paolo Giovio had. And one of the things that I think is intriguing is thinking about the kinds of origins that these paintings have. So the image on the left is actually originally created in Ethiopia as a gift to be given to a pope in Italy. So what it means for this painting to arrive from outside of Italy as a gift and then be collected, a copy of it, to be collected amongst all these other portraits, and what the other kinds of narratives that these series of paintings could carry for us are, right? And the image on the right instead was brought to us through an entry by Elizabeth Rodini, who was writing about the nature of the copy and what it means to sort of copy something, what it means to think about authenticity, what it means to think about how faithful we are to the original, and what it means to think about the original at all in the context of this work. I think that, one of the figures that we couldn't not touch on in this context was Alessandro de' Medici. And Alessandro de' Medici, who was the first Duke of Florence, most scholars agree is the son of Simonetta, an African servant in the Medici household. And I think that, within these two images, one of the things that we wanted to really think about, and this conversation was emerged by the scholar named John Brackett, who has written extensively about Alessandro de' Medici and about his mother, Simonetta, was the ways in which the different kinds of paintings have different audiences and hence have different roles that they're trying to play. So on the left, we have this sort of more dynastic portrait of Alessandro de' Medici presented in armor with the city behind him. There's heavy symbolism embedded in every layer. It is really meant to be an image of a ruler for the people which he is ruling, right? And it's meant to sort of go down through history in that way. It's meant for public consumption, right? Instead, the image on the right is a very intimate portrait. It's about 6 inches tall. And it's a portrait that was the one on the left was painted by Vasari. The one on the right is painted by Bronzino. And the image painted by Bronzino was intended potentially for the mistress of Alessandro de' Medici, and so it's a much more intimate portrait, both in scale, but then it's allowed to have certain vulnerabilities that the other portrait couldn't have. And so when we think about who the audience is, what it means to have something that's designed for public consumption versus something that's for private consumption, and the ways in which that changes everything about the painting, and then also what it means to have people that actually, the painters that knew Alessandro directly, right? So they weren't just brought in, but they had a relationship with him, and what that means in terms of the ways in which these paintings are done. So just to go through the list, this is an image by Carpaccio, the Aldobardieri, which is said to be a fragment of a larger painting. And there's a lot of mysteries around what this subject is meant to represent. This entry was brought to us by Kate Lowe, who has been a really incredible reference, assistant, and advisor to this project. Outside of contributing wonderful writing and wonderful research, she's also been really a huge help to me in my work in thinking about these subjects. And this particular entry brings to us a reflection on a Mamluk soldier and this unusual hat that you'll see in other depictions also in the Renaissance period called the Zamt. I personally didn't know very much about that history. And so I was really grateful for the ways in which this narration of those soldiers and the ways in which, basically a slave military body was engaged in sort of conquering different sites, but then also in ruling those sites. And more specifically, thinking about the mutability of different roles, social roles that are assigned, right, and status through this sort of military service. And Kate narrates for us also the fact that the Sultan granted 500 Black Africans the right to wear this high-level military official hat of the Zamt at a certain point in history, and this becomes something that actually then gets narrated over and over through painting for us. Carpaccio brings us to thinking about also Bellini and a whole range of painters that have been painting Black African figures in many different paintings, and the same is true about Carpaccio himself. And this sort of gathering brings us a reflection also on the ways in which, when we're thinking about the realities that are wanting to be narrated, the authenticity of representation, and artists really working to find sources to inform the ways in which this painting might be more credible, right, in regards to the history that's being narrated. Just to share a couple more examples real quick, this is the painting by Piero di Cosimo, The Liberation of Andromeda. This particular entry on being present was brought to us by Dennis Geronimus. And he brings to us a really beautiful reflection on this Black African figure who we see as a musician in the foreground, and the magical and truly inventive instrument that is being played. But then he also brings an interesting reflection on the figure of Andromeda. And he talks about the fact that it's as intriguing, perhaps, to think about the presence of this Black African musician as it is to think about the representation of Andromeda, the Ethiopian princess, as white. And so it's about this sort of, in a certain sense, we have a Black presence here that is visible and a Black presence here that is rendered invisible, right? Or that is neutralized in some ways. And I think that this becomes an interesting way to sort of engage in what's being told to us through the paintings, and what kinds of stories we can sort of look for as we move forward. And it was really wonderful working with Dennis because of all of the work that he had done on Piero di Cosimo, and the ways in which his narration of this figure also dove into all of the imagination that connected with the creation of this instrument. To share a couple more examples, this is an Albrecht Dürer painting. I'd say that one of the most familiar examples of Black African presence in Renaissance art in general that we have is through the representation of one of the three Magi. And in this case, Paul Kaplan, who is also another advisor for this project outside of being an amazing contributor to it, brings us a conversation about what it means to have this Black African Magus represented in the painting, and the fact that this is a tradition that actually comes out of a more northern tradition, represented in this case by Albrecht Dürer, and also some of the ways in which these kinds of narrations have the capacity to completely transform symbolism in art history. So at a certain point, it becomes something where you can't paint an adoration scene without including a Black Magus. And I think that that's a really important dimension to think about the fact that this was not always as it was in history. And then also thinking about the symbolism of what it means for this figure to be the youngest, to be the furthest from the Christ child, in all of the ways in which this sort of is embedded with other meaning as well. And Paul Kaplan has done some really amazing writing on the adoration scenes in general across history. And I invite you to look into that. And the cover image for the talk tonight, which is this, which is from a painting by Domenico Gabbiani. And this entry was brought to us actually by a historian of music named Emily Wilborn. And she brings to us this reflection on a court servant who is most likely also a musician. And there is other presence in Gabbiani paintings of musicians, and the ways in which, in this case, this is also a painting that's designed, again, for sort of comic relief. It's designed to have a theatricality that plays off of the symbolism that connects us to thinking about court paintings and representation, but then it's filled with representations of court entertainers that are designed to sort of get a laugh at the expense of the subjects that are represented. And she talks to us a lot about the different layers and what it means for us to have just these few identifying factors and be able to sort of really think about what kind of presence was actually existing in the Florentine court, and the ways in which most of the people that were around Florence in this time period were not represented in painting. So what it means for these figures to be represented. We did, I was invited by the director, Eike Schmidt, to create a series of videos in which I talk about each of these entries in depth. And I did that this summer through a project called Black Presence, and all of those are available online, where we're able to sort of dive a little bit more in depth into the meaning of these works and the kinds of scholarship that's involved. And again, just to sort of bring it up, we're working towards volume 2. And I just put a few symbolic images of what we're working to. I apologize for the quality of the slides here. But you know, basically right now we're designing the second chapter of this project. And the idea is to actually stimulate institutions, museums to really, so the Uffizi represents, you know, for a lot of people, the gatekeepers to this history. And so when these kinds of narrations are not part of the way in which they speak of the history that they hold, in a certain sense, we have an incomplete picture of what's actually behind those doors. And so by unlocking access to really reflecting upon these presences and the significance of them, and the ways in which they contribute to our understanding of today, contemporary Italy, I think it's really, really important. This is an image by Veronese, which is the Martirio of Santa Giustina. This is a portrait of Catherine, Caterina, brought by Albrecht Dürer. This is a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. There's a whole range that we're going to be pulling from. This is a drawing from Mantegna. And we'll be announcing soon also some of the information about this second volume, which is we're currently developing the list of contributors, and we're diving into the work, diving into the research, and really rethinking also the ways in which this kind of narration can be framed. And this brings me to the last slides and to the title, and that is the recovery plan. So basically the recovery plan is a larger framework which we're putting in place in order to sort of begin to think about how we frame the work of Black History Month Florence in the city of Florence and all of the layers of the research in which we're engaged. And it's born from a reflection that comes out of disaster recovery, right? And so these kinds of notations about what you need to do in order to recover from disaster is something that are sort of like guiding lights or guiding principles or guiding strategies. So basically when we think about Blackness in Black history in the context of Italy, in the context of Florence, we're actually talking about recovering from disasters, right? We're recovering from a whole range of exclusions in regards to the historical narrative. We're recovering a whole range of history. And I think in order to do that, we have to sort of really engage in this kind of planning that, again, is very cyclical, right? So we're thinking about gathering data, analyzing the impact that this data can have, thinking about the risk in regards to the kinds of narrations that are present and the ways in which those narrations can actually cause damage to our contemporary understandings of things, recovery strategies, building plans, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of a diagram of the process that we're actually constantly involved with that I think that On Being Present is one facet of, right? And so also in thinking about On Being Present, we're thinking about it as a sort of like disaster recovery. And thank you very much for your time. And I really appreciate the invitation to speak with all of you. And we're open to any questions that you may have. So I will unshare.
So thank you very much indeed, Justin, for that really provocative and interesting insight to the work you're doing. As always, we welcome now questions, comments, and thoughts from the audience. If you have something you want to contribute, just unmute yourself and speak, or if you prefer, you can put it in the chat and we can pick it up from there. So who would like to make a comment? Julia, go ahead.
Yes, on our website for the cemetery, there is a particular app called Slavery Tombs app. And we were visited by Frederick Douglass, the ex-slave, and we have the burial of Nadezhda. She was brought by Champollion Rossellini from their the Grand Duke sent them to Egypt and Nubia, and they brought back this 15-year-old slave whose freedom was bought by Rossellini's uncle. And she was only 15 when she came. She died at 30. She had been buried, she'd been baptized in a Russian Orthodox family with the name Nadezhda, which means hope. We don't have a picture of her, and I wish we did. Ijaba Shego, who is Somali born in Italy, has written a brilliant novel called La Linea del Colore, which is about to be translated into English. And she describes her heroine as a composite of Sarah Parker Raymond, who came here and got her MD in 1868 at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital with a letter from Mazzini. She was Black and an abolitionist. And also the other person who creates this composite was Edmonia Lewis, who was Black and Native American, and a brilliant sculptress in Rome. And what Ijaba Shego does is to create this character who is also involved with Frederick Douglass, as these two women were in Italy. And the character goes to the tomb of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was also part Black, from a slave-owning family in Jamaica who hated slavery as a result of that. And there she says the lines from Theodore Parker's writings, and he's buried with us as well. We have so many abolitionists. And the line that she says is, the arc of the moral universe bends slowly, but it bends towards justice, which Biden said in his when he was elected president, in his speech, which he took from Martin Luther King. And also Obama had said it at Nelson Mandela's funeral. And it really derived from Theodore Parker. So I find that Florence is absolutely chock-a-block full of the most important Black history in our time. And we need to share this information. And I do recommend Ijaba Shego's novel. It's brilliant.
Thanks so much, Julia, for that intervention. And you know, Julia has been a part of our program of Black History Month since 2017, giving tours of the cemetery and thinking about abolitionist history. And I think, you know, what I like to say is that there is no moment in history where, in the context of Italy, where Blackness is not present and where there's not a history that needs to be sort of excavated, reconsidered, and really thought about. And so I really appreciate your contribution.
Thank you.
Great. Other thoughts or questions?
May I?
Please.
Hi, Justin. I'm a fellow Black American woman living here in Florence, and I really appreciated your presentation. I took part in the Buffoni and Giocatori exhibition. I was a student curator for it. And the particular portrait that you showed of the two women and the Black person, where the two women were you were discussing about the sort of agricultural aspect of it, was something that they didn't actually know there was a Black person in the portrait until they'd cleaned it for that exhibition. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on, for instance, the difficulties of, let's say, the fact that so many pieces are in storage from museums and percentage-wise that we have never seen before or have never been digitized, et cetera, have never been treated, and what that ratio of, let's say, less important people continually being sort of shunted off into archives and storage, how that might change if we can potentially digitize and clean, and how that might change our perception of Blackness in Europe in terms of representation of sheer numbers.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, I did get a chance to see that exhibition, of course, at Palazzo Pitti, and to see the catalog that emerged from it. And I'd seen the Justice Susterman's portrait some years before, and was really sort of struck by it was super dark. You could see it, but you had to really look. You had to look close in order to recognize the figure in the background. So the cleaning we're actually really grateful for any sort of restoration that goes towards this. And actually, the project on Being Present was initiated with an accompanying reflection on restoration. Because I think that one of the subjects that does need to be addressed is maintenance, right? What it means to sort of, it costs money to maintain collections, to keep the images presentable, right? And then what we choose to restore versus what we don't, I think is what you're getting to as well, right? So the archive, I mean, it comes down to the archive. And I think that one of the things that's really potentially fascinating about the kind of work that could be done in the archives, for example, of the Uffizi, which has magazzini that are immense. I think it's important to think about the sort of digitizing of things, but then I think it's also important that for all institutions to really think about ways in which, in order to narrate and re-narrate collections, to rethink the ways in which we represent certain subjects or we don't. I think it's important to sort of go back and rethink also what we're determining as the most valuable work to come out and be shown, right? Because sometimes when we think about value, we don't have to think exclusively about the most celebrated figures, but we can think about what kind of narrative is present in work and what that can tell us about the way in which we're living today. And that's a different way of reflecting upon value that I think is really, really important to be injected. And I think it's also a way to sort of shake up scholarship, because I think that, there's a way in which, as I said before, a lot of scholars just won't get involved in conversations that don't lead all that far in terms of, actual documentation, and it's understandable. But I do think that who is going to do that work? And I think that, especially because of the ways in which there are certainly some sort of distinctions that are made between sort of academic researchers and artists, for example. So I'm an artist, I'm not a historian, and I didn't do the research of this project, right? I sort of framed it. I invited people to contribute to it. I worked to sort of make sure that it was emerging in a certain way through a platform that I thought would be visible. But I do think that, sometimes we're working with a lot of students right now. And so you were saying you were a student in working on that project. I think that kind of process of engaging students in research and the development of exhibitions is a great way to sort of plant a seed that then the students have to pick up, because it's really, it's going to be left to younger generations to sort of move forward anyway. And I think that in thinking about all these collections, if we really get down to it, all of the things that exist that have simply not been discussed or that people simply don't know about, it's really hard to even begin to discuss what that would look like. And I think that in a space like Italy, where, the holdings of most museums are much more expansive than what they're capable of maintaining, I think it becomes also a big question mark. My solicitation towards the Uffizi in regards to thinking about restoration, it was really about thinking about care, right? Because I think that what happens when we see the notes of restoration that analyze, the state, the condition of work, the work that needs to be done to bring it back to life, but also the mishaps, right? So you were saying this image that disappeared, but then there's other images. The one that I shared of Carpaccio, I shared 2 images of it because in one, there's 2 Black African figures, and the other, one of them disappears because it was determined later that it was an error in restoration, that they had included that figure in the first place. So previous restoration had painted this figure in. And so I think that there's all these layers that are written into restoration that are so fascinating and so important. And I think that, restoration is one of those processes that happens behind the scenes. And so it's not as celebrated as it should be. So the work that's being done to maintain and care for these works, to make them presentable, to allow them to persist through history is incredibly important work. And unfortunately, I think it's work that tends to be undervalued by the general public, where we just feel like the paintings show up in the museum and that's how they are, And the same is true about, the photographic documentation of work, which happens a lot of times through a process where it's very difficult to have an image that doesn't have a sheen or a certain reflection. And we went through extreme labor with a wonderful graphic designer and somebody who works on computers in general, named Jacopo Mazzoni. And he went through and actually retouched all of the images that are in On Being Present. And that's the reason why you can see these incredibly clear, wonderful images in the first place. Otherwise, we would just have, images with glare, images that are lit in different ways. So these are all the behind the scene layers that I really, really want to make sure that we can maybe think about giving value to, right? And really celebrating in terms of the people that are working behind the scenes, because that's most of the work. I
think a huge part of the other problem that is generally not addressed, and I'll just take that moment while people are actually interested in the topic, is to say that so many people mix their own pigments. And when we're talking about darker skinned colored people, we don't have the research and the experimentation to say, this is the way we should preserve these particular colors. We don't have ways to clean them. So when we're thinking about Black portraiture in Europe, there really is like zero scientific research on how to properly clean and restore specifically those tones, because they're mixed individually for these people, and they're generally limited representations.
Yeah, and I thank you for raising that point as well, which, honestly, in our first volume, the original proposal was to include an analysis from people working in conservation and restoration of the pigments that were being used. Because I think it's also something that I'm interested in, like what are the different processes that were used to paint a Black African, right? So when things are, when predominantly you're painting white figures, what does it mean to then say, oh, now I'm going to paint this? What is the palette choice? What is the process? Is it through, sort of veils of paint? Is it something that is done just through the core pigment itself? I think there's so many really fascinating questions that emerge from that. And then to your point, important research that needs to emerge about how do we maintain that? How do we care for it, right? So maybe that restoration of Carpaccio's piece, right, was not all that erroneous in including this Black African figure, right? But then, because maybe it had been poorly cleaned, right? So there's all these question marks, and I love the question marks that really diving into art history and really thinking about these. I love these question marks because I think it really invites us to think more profoundly about what's being represented and how to extend beyond the subject, how to extend beyond the content, and all of those different layers of the choices that are being made, and in caring for something, but then also in creating in the first place. So thank you so much, and we should be in touch. I'd love to be in touch about your work as well.
I'm friends with Thelonious, and he's said that he'll connect us.
Fantastic.
Justin, there's a couple of thoughts in the chat. Frederica asks whether the second volume of On Being Present will also be in hypervision on the Uffizi website.
That's an easy answer. Yes, it will. Okay. It should be launched in February 2021.
And Kimberly asks, how can we be kept informed? But it is a wonderful material. So how can they stay in touch?
So, you know, all of our work is housed on the website, which is blackhistorymonthflorence.com. Then beyond that, we have a Facebook page that we keep up to date with all the different things that we're working on. It usually has the events that we host, the projects that we're developing, and then beyond that, Instagram. But I think in general, especially around so we're currently working on the 6th edition of Black History Month Florence, which will take place in February. It'll have the theme Ostinato this time around. And I think that, you know, it's something that will become a different kind of reflection on this moment that we're living in. And hopefully it's something that also really takes us into designing long-term strategies for thinking about these subjects with all of our partners. And so, you know, it's easiest to follow all of those things on our website, on our Instagram, on our Facebook pages. So yeah, that answers that question, I think. And I'm looking at some other questions here. Right.
Alice wants to come in. Alice.
Oh, yes. I've been involved with Advancing Women Artists since the beginning, and I noticed that one of your, in the second phase was Bathsheba by Artemisia Gentileschi. And I just wanted to let you know that right now we are archiving a lot of the research that we did. And if you haven't been in touch with us, please do so, because a lot of the material for the rest, because that's one of the paintings we restored.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of information about how the restoration happened. And so I just pass that along.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is really fascinating. I'd love to learn more about it. Maybe you can, the contacts on Black History Month Florence's website are my direct contacts.
Okay.
You know, if you can send a note, I would love to be in touch with you. I've heard about your work mainly through the context of Saatchi, which is one of our partners.
Oh, yes.
And so, you know, in that context is where I've learned most about the work that you've been advancing. And that painting is actually one that I really wanted to be a part of the first volume, but I just couldn't find the right scholar to pick it up, you know, because of course I have ideas, but then it's like, but I think
two come to mind. So
yeah, we've been much more successful this time around. And so I can tell you that it's been confirmed that we will be speaking to and thinking about that painting, but it'd be wonderful to have the access to really thinking about the restoration that was done. And I thank you for that work. Again, it's not, as I said before, it's not celebrated enough, you know?
No, and well, the other thing I want to say is that after it was restored, it was hung up in the pity for several, I don't know how long, a couple of years, because that was part of the contract that we negotiated in order to restore it, but then it went back into storage. And every time I'm at the pity, which, as you can tell, I'm an American and I have been banned from Florence, and it's driving me crazy. But every time I'm at the pity, I ask about it, because I want to make sure they keep showing it. And it has been placed a lot in substitution for things that are out on loan. So again, I suggest to people that, especially some of the paintings you were talking about that are maybe in storage at the Uffizi, that you just keep asking when you go there. Can I see this? Where is it?
Soliciting, that's always important. I think one of the things that we hope moving forward in the future is also to be able to sort of, you know, I was very, very fortunate, and for the occasion of creating the videos for Black Presence, they pulled everything out of storage. And so I saw some of the pieces for the first time firsthand in that moment, right? You know, I'm an artist. And so, I mean, there's something about being in front of the actual work that really changes the dimensions and the ways in which we can think about it. And so I think that, yeah, that's, you know, it's important to solicit those things, but then it's also important to think about ways in which maybe we can create projects that might invite them out of those darker spaces, that might generate a different kind of buzz around the work, because I think it's also that, right? You know, all museums are working towards what's most asked about, right? And so as scholarship emerges, as conversations are generated about these works, it's clear that they'll be much more likely to show up in the halls and to be on display. A lot of the works that we covered are on display, but you know, certainly there's a lot that needs to sort of be brought back out, and I really appreciate your work though.
Oh, thank you.
So
Okay.
I see couple other questions here. One is, well, about funding. Well, it's an easy question. How are you funded as Black History Month? Because we're, basically in 5 years of operation, we have not received administrating funding at all. So all of our projects are advanced by me and my team, which works on voluntary basis. And it's, we have a structure that's set up where each of the institutions that we're working with is technically responsible for sort of covering and caring for the expenses related to what they're doing, or we couple them with other institutions that are capable of that. The project on Being Present was funded actually by a private donor through Saatchi. The second volume, we're actually, if anybody has a lot of money they want to give, we're in the process of trying to actually raise the funding for that second volume. And that question is connected to a 501c3. I was on a group call yesterday with a whole bunch of lawyers who are actually starting a 501c3 for us in the United States right now. We do have a nonprofit association in the context of Italy, but in the United States, we're establishing that right now. So we'll see where it leads us. But technically, we don't really have funding, but we are very, very creative in thinking about different kinds of value exchanges and different kinds of exchanges of knowledge and service. And I think that in that process, it's been incredibly helpful to have such a broad network of different people who are all committed to a similar thought, and to be able to rely on sort of cross-institutional collaborations that might not happen otherwise.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any more thoughts or questions? Because we're beginning to get to the end of the time. If not, if any of you are not already on our mailing list, please subscribe, because every Monday we put out a What's On message telling people what's happening, what's coming up next. It's a way to stay in touch. And as always, I ask you to consider making a donation. Sarah will put up the site there. We rely on your help to keep us going through this long and difficult crisis, but we're doing okay. And thanks hugely to Justin for that. I can say that Justin and I are meeting next week to talk about how the Institute can collaborate with Black History Month in February. So hopefully we'll have some more on these kinds of themes coming through at that point. And otherwise, we'll see some of you tomorrow for the final chapter of The Future of Florence, Firenze in our discussions. And then next week it's Raffaello and the cartoons commissioned by the Medici Pope and other.
I would say that I'm very curious and interested in the conversation of like how to rebuild Florence better. I mean, I think that a lot of the work that we have been engaged in is about a sort of future that we're hoping for, right? And sort of what it means to sort of think about and excavate the past as a way to really plan for the future and plan for a different future, right? So I'll definitely sit in and follow the conversation there. And thank you again for the invitation. And of course, anyone who is interested in sort of being involved in any way with Black History Month and our work, just reach out. We're a small team, but we have a lot of really young and energetic people that are enthusiastic about this kind of work. And there is no facet of culture that we're not interested in.
We'll put your website on the Monday What's On when we wrap up this session. So
fantastic.
Okay. All good. Well, thanks everyone. Have a good night wherever you are, or good morning when you're on the West Coast like Barbara. And we'll see you again soon. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.